On September 5, 2017, Cartoon Network pulled an episode of The Amazing World of Gumball from its scheduled broadcast slot in multiple territories, with no public explanation. The episode had already been produced. It had been animated, it had been voiced, it had been through the full production pipeline, through storyboarding and scripting and voice direction, and compositing and final review, and it had been approved for broadcast. And then, less than 2 weeks before its scheduled air date, the episode was pulled. The network issued no press release. The network made no public statement. The network simply removed the episode from the schedule and replaced it with a rerun, as if the episode had never existed, as if the hours of labor and the thousands of frames and the creative decisions that went into producing it had been erased from the production timeline. The episode was not the first to disappear. It would not be the last, and the disappearances, the quiet removals and silent delays and unexplained edits that punctuate the production history of The Amazing World of Gumball are the subject of tonight's video. There are 10 of these, 10 scandals, 10 moments where the show collided with something larger than itself, something institutional or cultural or legal or ethical, and the collision produced consequences that the show's audience was never fully informed about. Some are well known to dedicated fans, some are almost entirely undocumented. All of them reveal something about the conditions under which animated television is produced, broadcast, and consumed in the 21st century. We will go through them in order. Before we continue, subscribing helps us keep making these long videos. It is free and it takes a moment. Now, back to the scandals. The first scandal began not with an episode, but with a concept. When Ben Bocquelet initially developed The Amazing World of Gumball at Cartoon Network Development Studio Europe in London, the show's original concept was built around reject characters, character designs that had been created for other projects and never used. The concept was appealing. It was also, as the production team discovered during development, legally complicated. Some of the rejected character designs that Bocquelet wanted to use had been created during his work at other studios. Some had been created during collaborative projects. Some existed in a legal gray area where the ownership of the design was not clearly established. The question of who owned the reject characters, the question of whether Bocquelet had the right to use designs that had been created in professional contexts for other clients, became the show's first scandal before the show had even aired a single episode. The resolution involved significant changes to the character roster. Designs that could not be cleared legally were replaced with new designs created specifically for the show. Characters whose visual origins were too closely tied to their previous professional contexts were redesigned, sometimes substantially, to ensure that the final versions were legally distinct from their predecessors. The process was painful. It involved abandoning character designs that Bocquelet and his team had become attached to. Designs that had personalities and backstories and the kind of creative weight that comes from being imagined before being drawn. Some of the rejected rejects, the characters who were too legally entangled to survive the transition from concept to production, disappeared from the show's development entirely. Others were transformed, their essential qualities preserved, but their visual identities altered enough to satisfy the legal requirements. The scandal was resolved before the show reached the public. Most viewers have no idea it happened. Most viewers do not know that the characters they love are, in some cases, the second or third version of characters who existed in different forms before the show began. The legal dispute shaped the cast. It determined which characters survived into the series and which were sent to their own private void, erased not by narrative necessity but by intellectual property law. And the erasure, which mirrors the void mythology that the show would eventually develop, is the first scandal's most unsettling resonance. The show about characters who are rejected from the world was itself forced to reject characters from its own world. The fiction anticipated the reality. The mythology predicted its own origin. The legal process that resolved the first scandal took months. Lawyers on both sides examined the origins of each character design in question, tracing the creative lineage back through Bocquelet's career, through the studios where he had worked, through the projects he had contributed to before Gumball existed. The examination was forensic. It required documentation of when each design was created, under what employment terms, with what tools, in what capacity. Was the design created during work hours? Was it created using studio equipment? Was it created as part of a commissioned project? Each answer carried legal weight. Each answer determined whether a character could survive into the show or whether it would need to be redesigned from the ground up. The impact on the show's creative development was significant. Characters that the team had spent months developing, characters that had personalities and relationships, and the kind of creative momentum that comes from being imagined into existence, had to be abandoned or fundamentally altered. The process was not merely legal, It was emotional. The creative team had to let go of characters they loved because the law said those characters did not fully belong to them. The experience shaped the team's approach to character creation for the remainder of the series. New characters were designed with clear documentation of their origins. The legal uncertainty that plagued the show's early development was replaced by a rigorous process of creative record-keeping that ensured every character was legally unambiguous. The first scandal also raised broader questions about creative ownership in the animation industry that the show's specific resolution did not answer. The animation industry is built on collaboration. Studios employ artists who create characters during work hours using studio resources. The legal ownership of those creations typically belongs to the studio, not the artist. But the creative ownership, the emotional and intellectual investment that the artist has in the character they designed, does not transfer with the legal ownership. The artist who created the character carries the character with them when they leave the studio. The character lives in the artist's imagination, in the artist's creative vocabulary, in the specific way the artist thinks about design and personality and visual storytelling. And the carrying, which is invisible, which is internal, which cannot be measured or documented or litigated, creates a tension between legal reality and creative reality that the animation industry has never fully resolved. Bocalet carried characters with him from previous studios. The law said he could not use them. The creativity that produced them could not be cleanly separated from the creativity that would produce new characters. The rejected characters, the ones who did not survive the legal review, are themselves a piece of scandal lore that exists only in the memories of the people who worked on the show's early development. Some of the rejected designs have been glimpsed in concept art shared during convention panels or in production documents that have surfaced in fan communities. The glimpses are tantalizing. They show characters with distinctive designs, with personalities that are visible in the posture and the expression and the specific quality of the line work. They show characters who could have been part of the show. Characters who, in a different legal reality, would have stood beside Gumball and Darwin and Nicole and walked down the same photographed streets and inhabited the same narrative world. The characters are ghosts. They are the show's first void residents, and the ghostliness, the haunting quality of characters who almost existed, who were conceived and designed and imagined, and then removed before the audience ever saw them, is the first scandal's most poetic consequence. The show that would eventually create a mythology about erased characters began by erasing characters. The legal resolution also shaped the show's creative identity in ways that the production team could not have anticipated. The need to design new characters from scratch, characters that were legally unencumbered, characters that belonged entirely to the show rather than to any previous creative context, forced the team to invent with more freedom and more ambition than they might have exercised if the original designs had been available. The legal constraint produced creative liberation, the rejection of the old open space for the new. And the new characters, the ones that were designed specifically for Gumball, the ones that had no previous life, no previous context, no previous legal entanglements, were in many cases more interesting, more distinctive, and more thematically rich than the characters they replaced. The constraint improved the work. The scandal improved the show. The question of what constitutes an original character is one that the animation industry has never satisfactorily resolved. A character is a collection of visual elements, personality traits, narrative functions, and audience associations. Change the color of a character's hair and you have a different character. Or do you? Change the shape of a character's body and you have a different character. Or do you? The legal review that Bocalet's designs underwent was an exercise in drawing lines where no natural lines exist, in determining where influence ends and originality begins, in quantifying something that resists quantification. The lawyers involved in the process were not animation experts. They were trained to identify similarity and to assess risk. Their vocabulary was the vocabulary of liability, not creativity. And the decisions they made, the characters they flagged, and the characters they cleared shaped the show in ways that had nothing to do with what was best for the story, and everything to do with what was safest for the corporation. The creative team's response to the legal constraints deserves more attention than it typically receives. Rather than treating the forced redesigns as a setback, several members of the production team later described the process as unexpectedly liberating. The constraints forced invention. Characters that had been designed with one set of assumptions were rebuilt with different assumptions, and the rebuilding produced designs that were often stranger, more distinctive, and more suited to the show's emerging visual identity than the originals had been. The show that eventually reached television was not the show that Bocalet had originally pitched. It was the show that survived the legal process. And the survival, which required adaptation and reinvention, produced something that the original pitch might never have achieved on its own. The first scandal also established a pattern that would repeat throughout the show's history. A force external to the creative team, whether legal, corporate, regulatory, or cultural, would impose a constraint. The creative team would absorb the constraint. The constraint would reshape the show, and the reshaped show would emerge, paradoxically, stronger than it had been before the constraint was imposed. This pattern, which you will see repeated in nearly every scandal that follows, is the closest thing to a thesis that the show's production history offers. The characters who survived the legal review and made it into the show carried, invisibly, the history of the ones who did not. Every design that appeared on screen was a design that had been examined, questioned, defended, and ultimately cleared. The clearance was not a creative endorsement, it was a legal determination that the risk of litigation was acceptably low. And the difference between creative endorsement and legal clearance is the difference between making art and making a product that will not generate lawsuits. The show existed in both categories simultaneously, as all commercially produced animation does. And the first scandal was the moment where the tension between those categories became visible. The broader implications of the first scandal extend beyond Gumball to the animation industry as a whole. Every animated series that has ever been produced has undergone some version of this process. Characters are checked against existing intellectual property, designs are reviewed for potential similarity to trademarked properties. The review is standard practice, invisible to the audience, and fundamentally at odds with the myth of the solitary creator working from pure imagination. The animation industry does not produce work from pure imagination. It produces work from constrained imagination, and the constraints are legal, financial, technological, and cultural. The first scandal was the show's first encounter with this reality, and the encounter, while painful for the creators who had to watch their original designs be dismantled and rebuilt, was also the show's first demonstration of a quality that would define it for the next decade: the ability to absorb a blow and come back stronger. The characters that emerged from the legal process were not the characters that went in. They were better, and the betterment, which was not planned and not desired and not the result of any creative ambition, was the first scandal's unexpected gift to the show's future. The first scandal was unremarkable in its mechanics. What made it remarkable was the show's response, which was to transform constraint into creative fuel. The first scandal is a scandal about the impossibility of separating a creator from their creations, about the legal fiction that ideas have clean boundaries, about the messy, overlapping, entangled reality of creative work in a collaborative industry. The second scandal came less than a year after the show's premiere, and it involved the show's visual style rather than its characters. The mixed media approach that defines Gumball, the combination of photographic backgrounds with animated characters, produced a controversy that most viewers have never heard about. The photographic backgrounds were sourced from real locations, real streets, real buildings, real homes. And the use of real locations as backgrounds for a fictional show raised questions about permission, about privacy, about the rights of property owners whose buildings and homes appeared in an animated television series without their explicit consent. The legal landscape around using photographs of real locations in fictional works is complex and varies by jurisdiction. Generally, photographing the exterior of a building from a public location is permitted, and using such photographs in creative works falls under various fair use and creative expression protections. The show's production team operated within these legal frameworks, but the frameworks are not universally understood, and the appearance of identifiable real-world locations in the show's backgrounds generated complaints from individuals who recognized their homes, their businesses, their neighborhoods in the backgrounds of a cartoon they had never agreed to participate in. The complaints did not result in legal action, they did not result in the removal of any episodes, but they did result in changes to the production process. The show's background team became more careful about the identifiability of specific locations. They increased the level of digital processing applied to photographic backgrounds, making the real locations less recognizable while preserving the photographic quality that defined the show's visual identity. The backgrounds became more abstracted, more processed, more clearly artistic interpretations of real locations, rather than direct reproductions. And the shift, which occurred gradually across the first and second seasons, is visible to viewers who compare early episodes with later ones. The backgrounds evolve. The photographic quality remains, but the specificity diminishes. The streets are still real streets, but they are less clearly any particular street. The buildings are still real buildings, but they are less obviously any particular building. The show learned to use reality without reproducing it. And the learning, which was driven by complaint rather than by creative choice, is the second scandal's contribution to the show's visual evolution. The second scandal raises questions that extend beyond the specifics of the show into the broader territory of visual culture and the right to representation. When does a photograph of a public space become proprietary? When does the use of a real location in a fictional context constitute an imposition on the people who live or work in that location? The law is relatively clear. Photography in public spaces is generally protected. The use of publicly visible architecture in creative works is generally permitted. But the law and the feeling are not the same thing. The legal right to use a photograph of someone's home in a cartoon does not address the emotional discomfort that the homeowner might experience upon discovering that their home is part of the fiction they did not choose to participate in. The complaints came primarily from residents who identified their specific streets, their specific intersections, their specific neighborhoods in the show's backgrounds. For these residents, the experience of seeing their real environment inhabited by animated characters was not merely surprising. It was the experience of having the boundary between fiction and reality breached, in a direction they had not anticipated. Fiction had entered their world. A cartoon had colonized their street. Characters they did not create were walking on sidewalks they used every day. And the colonization, which was benign, which caused no physical damage, which imposed no measurable cost, still felt like a violation. It felt like their reality had been taken from them and given to a show. The production team's response evolved over time. Initially, the photographic backgrounds were sourced with minimal processing. The real-world origins were clearly visible. As the complaints accumulated, the processing increased. Filters were applied, colors were shifted, geometric elements were altered, the backgrounds remained photographic in quality but became less specifically identifiable. The evolution was not announced. It was not discussed in interviews or behind-the-scenes features. It simply happened quietly across episodes as the production team adjusted their process in response to external pressure that was never publicly acknowledged. The second scandal is ultimately a scandal about the show's most fundamental creative decision. The decision to use real photographs was the decision that defined the show's visual identity. It was the decision that separated Gumball from every other animated series. And the decision, which was creatively liberating, which gave the show its distinctive tension between the real and the animated, was also the decision that made the show vulnerable to a category of complaint that no other animated series faced. The photographic backgrounds were the show's greatest strength and the show's most persistent liability. They were the source of the show's visual distinction and the source of the show's second scandal. And the duality, the fact that the same decision produced both the show's greatest asset and its most awkward controversy, is a piece of scandal lore about the relationship between creative ambition and unintended consequence. The most distinctive choice is always the most vulnerable choice. The thing that makes you unique is always the thing that makes you a target. The second scandal also produced an unintended consequence that the show's creators could not have predicted. It made the real-world locations famous. Fans who identified the photographed backgrounds began visiting the real locations. They took photographs of themselves standing in front of the buildings that appeared in the show. They documented the differences between the real location and its animated version. They created an informal tourism around the show's backgrounds that transformed mundane suburban landscapes into destinations. The locations that had complained about being used without permission became, in some cases, points of pride. The connection to a beloved animated series gave ordinary buildings and ordinary streets an identity that they had not previously possessed. The scandal that began with complaints about unauthorized use evolved in some cases into appreciation for unexpected association. The transformation is not unique to Gumball. It is a pattern that recurs whenever fiction uses real locations. The initial reaction is often resistance. The long-term consequence is often embrace. And the evolution from resistance to embrace is a piece of scandal lore about the relationship between fiction and reality that is more complex than the initial complaint suggested. The legal frameworks surrounding the use of real locations in animated works have not been significantly altered by the second scandal. The frameworks remain as they were, generally permissive of the use of publicly visible architecture in creative works, with specific protections for privacy and for commercially identifiable properties. The scandal did not change the law, but it changed the practice. It changed the way the Gumball production team approached the sourcing and processing of photographic backgrounds. And the change, which was practical rather than legal, which was driven by a desire to avoid future complaints, rather than by a legal requirement to do so, is the second scandal's most enduring impact on the show's production process. The show adapted, the show learned, the show incorporated the scandal's lessons into its creative practice. And the incorporation, which was invisible to the audience, which was hidden in the technical details of background processing that no viewer would ever examine, was the scandal's resolution. The fan response to the photographic backgrounds created an entirely separate dimension of the scandal. Viewers who recognized the real locations began making pilgrimages. They visited the streets of Vallejo, California, where many of the show's backgrounds had been photographed. They took photographs of themselves standing in front of the real versions of fictional locations. They posted these photographs online with the same enthusiasm that fans of live-action shows visit filming locations. But the residents of those streets had not signed up for tourism. They had not consented to their homes becoming landmarks in an animated universe. The houses and storefronts that appeared in the show were real places where real people lived and worked, and the attention generated by the fan pilgrimages, while mostly benign, was attention that the residents had never anticipated and could not control. The privacy implications extended beyond the physical locations. Some of the photographs used as backgrounds contained details that were identifiable: license plates, business names that could be used to locate specific addresses. The production team had processed the photographs, altering colors and adding stylistic filters. But the alterations did not always obscure the identifying details. A persistent viewer with access to Google Street View could, and in several documented cases did, identify the exact locations where the background photographs had been taken. The identification was treated as a game by the fan community, a treasure hunt that added another layer of engagement with the show. But the treasure being hunted was other people's privacy. The production's shift in approach to background creation happened gradually rather than all at once. Early seasons relied heavily on unmodified photographs. Later seasons introduced more digital manipulation, more composite backgrounds assembled from multiple source images, more purely digital environments that referenced the photographic aesthetic without using actual photographs. The transition was driven partly by the privacy concerns and partly by the natural evolution of the show's visual language. But the transition also changed the show's visual identity in ways that long-term viewers noticed. The backgrounds became cleaner, more controlled, less accidentally real. And the loss of that accidental reality, the loss of the specific quality that came from using photographs of actual places, was a cost that the privacy concerns imposed on the show's aesthetics. There is a philosophical dimension to the background scandal that rarely gets discussed. The show's use of real photographs as backgrounds for animated characters created a visual language that was inherently surreal. Cartoon characters walked through real streets. Animated bodies inhabited photographic spaces. The collision between the two visual registers, the flat precision of animation and the textured imperfection of photography, was the show's most distinctive aesthetic contribution. It was not simply a stylistic choice. It was a statement about the relationship between fiction and reality, between imagination and the physical world. The background said, "This world is real." The characters said, "This world is not real." And the audience, holding both truths simultaneously, experienced something that no other animated series was offering. The legal and ethical questions raised by the background controversy have not been definitively resolved. The use of public spaces as source material for creative work exists in a legal gray zone that varies by jurisdiction. In the United States, photographing a building from a public street is generally legal, but using that photograph as a commercial product, as a background in a television show that generates advertising revenue, introduces complications that the simple right to photograph does not address. The show's production team navigated this gray zone through a combination of legal advice, practical caution, and the eventual shift toward more heavily processed backgrounds that maintains the photographic aesthetic without the photographic specificity. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a legal ruling, not a public statement, just a quiet adjustment to a production pipeline made by people who had learned that even the most creative choices have consequences that creativity alone cannot resolve. The third scandal was louder and more public than the first two, and it involved content that viewers and parents considered inappropriate for the show's target audience. Gumball, despite its bright colors and its Cartoon Network time slot, has always contained content that operates on multiple levels. Jokes that work as slapstick for children work simultaneously as social commentary or innuendo for older viewers. References that are invisible to young audiences are immediately apparent to adults. And the dual-level content, which is a common feature of animated series, and which is generally accepted as a creative strategy that broadens a show's appeal, occasionally crossed lines that different audiences drew in different places. Specific episodes generated complaints from parents groups and media watchdog organizations. The complaints targeted sexual innuendo, violent imagery, and thematic content that the complainants considered too mature for a show broadcast in a children's time slot. The complaints were not uniform. Different episodes generated different complaints from different groups. Some groups objected to content that other groups found unobjectionable. The landscape of complaint was fragmented, contradictory, and reflective of the broader cultural disagreements about what children should and should not be exposed to. Cartoon Network responded to the complaints on a case-by-case basis. Some episodes were edited for subsequent broadcasts, with specific jokes or visual gags removed or replaced. Some episodes were rescheduled to later time slots. Some episodes that were considered acceptable in one territory were modified for broadcast in territories with different content standards. The patchwork of responses created multiple versions of the show, different gumballs that existed simultaneously in different territories, each one shaped by the specific complaints and the specific regulatory environment of its broadcast region. The most significant content-related complaint involved an episode that contained a scene depicting a kiss between two male characters. The scene was brief. It was not the focus of the episode. It was presented as part of the show's established approach to relationships, which treats all forms of connection with the same matter-of-fact normalcy. But the scene generated intense reaction in certain territories. In some countries, the episode was broadcast with the scene intact. In others, the scene was edited out. In a small number of territories, the episode was not broadcast at all. The variations in response created a map of global attitudes toward LGBTQ representation in children's media. A map that the show's creators had not set out to draw, but that their creative choices inadvertently produced. The show's creative team has spoken about the content complaints in interviews, and their responses constitute their own piece of scandal lore. The team maintained that the show's content was appropriate for its audience. They maintained that children are capable of processing more complex themes than many adults give them credit for. They maintained that the dual-level content strategy was a feature of the show's design, not a flaw, and that removing or modifying the content that operated on the adult level would diminish the show's quality and integrity. The defense was consistent. The defense was articulate. And the defense was not always successful. Episodes were still edited, content was still removed. The institutional response to complaint overrode the creative team's defense of their work, and the overriding the institutional power to modify creative work over the objections of the people who created it is the third scandal's most enduring lesson. Creative integrity exists within institutional constraints, and when integrity and constraints collide, constraints win. The specific episodes that generated the most intense content complaints are worth examining individually because the complaints reveal as much about the complainants as they do about the show. An early episode that depicted Nicole Watterson in a state of extreme anger, physically dominating the environment around her with a level of intensity that the complainants considered violent, generated letters from parents who felt that the depiction of maternal rage was inappropriate for children. The complaint is revealing. It is not about violence per se. Children's animation is full of violence. It is about the discomfort of seeing a mother character, a character who is supposed to embody nurture and safety, depicted as a force of destruction. The complaint is about the violation of a gendered expectation, and the violation, which is the show's point, which is the show's deliberate challenge to the idea that mothers must be gentle and fathers must be strong, was perceived as inappropriate precisely because it was effective. The show challenged a convention. The challenge was felt. The feeling was uncomfortable, and the discomfort was reported as a complaint. The LGBTQ representation controversy deserves particular attention because it illustrates the global stakes of content decisions in children's media. The scene in question depicted two male characters sharing a kiss. The scene was not dramatic, it was not a major plot point. It was a background moment, a piece of the show's environmental storytelling. A detail that the show included as part of its commitment to depicting a world in which all forms of connection exist. The scene's very casualness was, for some audiences, its most offensive quality. The scene did not argue for LGBTQ acceptance. It did not make a case, it did not present the kiss as a moment of significance. It simply showed it happening, as if it were normal, as if it required no comment, as if two male characters kissing were as unremarkable as any other form of physical affection. And the normalcy was what the complainants objected to. They did not object to the argument for LGBTQ acceptance because the show made no argument. They objected to the assumption of LGBTQ normalcy. They objected to the show treating something they considered exceptional as if it were ordinary. The territorial variations in response to the scene created a patchwork of censorship that is visible to anyone who compares the episode across international broadcasts. In territories where LGBTQ representation in children's media is legally protected or culturally accepted, the scene aired without modification. In territories where such representation is legally restricted or culturally contested, the scene was removed, sometimes replaced with an alternate shot, sometimes simply cut, leaving a jarring gap in the episode's flow that was itself a form of visible censorship. The gap told you something was missing. The gap said something was here, and now it is not. And the viewer who encountered the gap, the viewer in the territory where the scene was removed, knew that something had been taken from them. They might not know what, but they knew that the version of the show they were watching was not the complete version, and the knowing, the awareness that your version is less than the full version, is a specific kind of cultural injury that censorship inflicts on the audiences it claims to protect. The content scandals, taken collectively, reveal a pattern that extends beyond any individual complaint. The pattern is this: the show's most controversial content is consistently its most honest content. The scenes that generate complaints are the scenes where the show drops its comedic armor and shows something real. Real anger, real affection, real pain, real connection. The comedy is never controversial. The slapstick is never controversial. The absurdism is never controversial. The controversy only arrives when the show tells the truth. When the show shows a mother who is angry enough to break walls. When the show shows two people who love each other regardless of gender. When the show shows a family that is struggling in ways that are uncomfortable to witness. The truth is the controversy. And the truth, which the show refuses to abandon despite the complaints, despite the edits, despite the institutional pressure to be less honest, is the third scandal's most important lesson. Honesty is expensive. Honesty generates complaints. Honesty creates institutional friction. And honesty is the only thing that makes the show worth watching. The editing process that produced the modified versions of controversial episodes is itself a piece of scandal lore that reveals the mechanics of institutional content management. When an episode was flagged for content concerns, the production team was typically given the choice between modifying the episode and having the episode removed from broadcast. The choice was not really a choice. Removal meant that the episode would not be seen. Modification meant that a compromised version of the episode would be seen. The team chose modification because modification preserved most of the work, most of the animation, most of the voice performances, most of the creative vision. The modification removed only the specific elements that had generated complaints, and the removal was designed to be as invisible as possible, to create the impression that the modified version was the original version, that nothing had been changed, that the episode the viewer was watching was the episode that the production team intended to make. But the modifications were not always invisible. Skilled editing could remove a joke or a visual gag without disrupting the episode's flow. But some removals left gaps, moments where the pacing stuttered, moments where a scene transitioned too abruptly, moments where the emotional arc of a sequence did not quite land because the element that completed the arc had been removed. The gaps were the fingerprints of the editing. They were the evidence that something had been changed, and the evidence which was visible to attentive viewers, which was detectable to anyone who watched the episodes carefully enough to notice that the rhythms were slightly off, created a secondary scandal. The scandal of invisible censorship. The scandal of changes made so quietly that the audience does not know they are watching a modified product. The scandal of the assumption that you do not deserve to know what was changed. The cumulative effect of the content modifications across the show's run is difficult to assess. Dozens of episodes were modified for at least one territory. The modifications ranged from the removal of a single frame to the replacement of entire scenes. The total amount of content that was produced but never broadcast, the total volume of creative work that was completed and then edited out before it reached the audience is not publicly known, but the volume is significant. It represents hours of animation, dozens of voice performances, hundreds of individual creative decisions that were made by the production team and then unmade by the institutional review process. The unmade decisions are a body of creative work that exists only in the production archives. They are the show's shadow self, the version of the show that would have existed if no complaint had ever been filed, if no regulator had ever intervened, if no network executive had ever flagged a scene for review. The shadow self is larger than the broadcast self. The shadow self contains more, and the more, which you will almost certainly never see, is the third scandal's final accounting. The show was bigger than what was broadcast. The show contained more truth than it was allowed to show. The show's handling of gender and sexuality became the most contentious element of the content complaints. The relationship between Darwin and Carrie, which included physical affection, was treated differently by different regulatory bodies. Some territories accepted the relationship without comment. Others flagged it for review because of the interspecies dimension, which regulators in certain markets interpreted as potentially confusing for young viewers. The kiss between two male characters in a later season, which was brief and contextual and narratively motivated, generated the most intense regulatory response of any single scene in the show's history. Markets that had previously aired the show without modification suddenly required edits. The scene, which lasted seconds, consumed hours of editorial discussion across multiple continents. Nicole Watterson's rage episodes became another recurring point of contention. The character's anger, which the show depicted as physically destructive and occasionally terrifying, was flagged by parent groups and regulatory bodies, who argued that the depictions normalized domestic violence. The show's creators argued that Nicole's anger was always contextual, always provoked, and always resolved within the episode's narrative framework. But the argument required nuance, and nuance is the first casualty of a content complaint. The complaint form does not have a field for narrative context. The complaint form asks, did the show depict violence? The answer, stripped of context, was always yes. The process by which content complaints were evaluated within Cartoon Network involved multiple layers of review that operated independently of each other. A complaint filed by a viewer in the United States followed a different procedural path than a complaint filed by a regulatory body in Australia. A complaint about sexual content was escalated differently than a complaint about violence. A complaint from an organized advocacy group carried more institutional weight than a complaint from an individual parent, regardless of the merit of either complaint. The institutional processing of complaints created its own patterns of bias and emphasis that shaped which complaints received attention and which were filed and forgotten. The show's writers developed an intuitive understanding of where the boundaries were, which jokes would survive the review process, and which would be flagged, which visual gags could remain in the background, and which would attract attention. This intuitive understanding was itself a form of self-censorship, but it was self-censorship born of experience, rather than fear. The writers knew the system. They knew which battles were worth fighting and which would consume time and energy without producing a result. They learned to embed their most subversive ideas in forms that the review process was less likely to catch. A joke delivered entirely through visual composition, with no dialogue that could be transcribed and flagged, was harder for a compliance reviewer to identify than a joke delivered through words. The show's visual sophistication, which is one of its most praised qualities, was partly a creative strategy for surviving the content review process. The generational dimension of the content complaints deserves attention. The parents who filed complaints about the show's content had grown up with a different model of what children's animation could be. The standards they applied, the thresholds of acceptability they enforced, were calibrated to an era when animated shows for children operated within much narrower creative boundaries. The show was not made for those parents. It was made for their children, and the children whose tolerance for complexity and ambiguity was significantly higher than their parents assumed received the show's content without the distress that the complaints predicted. The gap between what parents feared the content would do to their children and what the content actually did is the gap that the third scandal occupies. The shadow archive of content that was produced but never broadcast, or broadcast in modified form, represents a version of the show that exists only in production files and in the memories of the people who made it. Every animated series has this shadow archive, but Gumball's shadow archive is larger than most because the show's creative ambitions were larger than most, which meant the gap between what the creators wanted to make and what the regulators allowed them to air was wider than usual. And the gap between what the show contained and what the audience received is the measure of the scandal's cost. The fourth scandal involved a specific episode that generated controversy not for its content. An episode of Gumball that contained themes of destruction, chaos, and the collapse of social order was scheduled to air in the weeks following a real-world event that involved destruction, chaos, and the collapse of social order. The coincidence between the episode's content and the real-world event created a sensitivity that the network could not ignore. The episode was delayed. Its broadcast was postponed until the cultural moment had passed, until the association between the fictional destruction and the real-world destruction had faded enough that viewers could watch the episode without being reminded of the event. The delay was not unique to Gumball. Television networks routinely delay or reschedule episodes whose content coincidentally mirrors real-world events. The practice is considered standard, but the practice reveals something about the relationship between fiction and reality that the delay itself cannot resolve. The episode's content did not change. The destruction in the episode was the same destruction before and after the real-world event. What changed was the context. What changed was the meaning that the audience would bring to the content. The same scene that would have been received as comedy in one week would have been received as insensitivity in another. And the gap between comedy and insensitivity, which is a gap of context rather than content, is the fourth scandal's contribution to our understanding of how meaning works. Meaning is not in the text. Meaning is in the space between the text and the audience. And the space changes, and when the space changes, the text changes with it, even though the text has not been altered. The fourth scandal also reveals the extent to which animated series, despite their apparent distance from reality, are subject to the same contextual forces that shape the reception of all media. The assumption that cartoons exist in a separate space, that their fictional nature insulates them from the meanings that real-world events produce, is an assumption that the fourth scandal disproves. Cartoons are not separate. Cartoons exist in the same cultural space as everything else. They are watched by people who also watch the news. They are consumed by minds that also process real-world events. And the connections that those minds draw between fiction and reality cannot be prevented by the fictional nature of the content. The cartoon does not know about the real-world event, but the viewer does. And the viewer's knowledge changes the cartoon. The viewer's context changes the content. And the change is real even though the change is entirely in the viewer's mind. The delay pattern also raises questions about the selective nature of sensitivity. Not all episodes that contained destruction were delayed. Not all episodes that depicted chaos were reconsidered. The decision to delay was made on a case-by-case basis, and the basis was not consistent. Some episodes that were thematically similar to delayed episodes aired without modification. Some episodes that were less similar were delayed anyway. The inconsistency suggests that the decisions were driven by institutional anxiety rather than by systematic analysis. The network delayed the episodes that made it nervous. And the nervousness was not about the content. The nervousness was about the potential response. The nervousness was about the headline. The potential headline: network airs episode about destruction days after real disaster. The headline that was never written because the delay prevented it. The fourth scandal is a scandal about preemptive reputation management. The timing scandal also connects to a broader conversation about the relationship between fiction and violence that has been ongoing in American media for decades. Every time a real-world tragedy occurs, every time a shooting or a bombing or a natural disaster makes the news, the entertainment industry performs a ritual of self-examination that is part genuine concern and part institutional self-preservation. Episodes are pulled, premieres are delayed, scenes are edited. The ritual is familiar enough that it has its own vocabulary and its own procedures. And the procedures exist not because they are effective at preventing harm, but because they are effective at preventing blame. A network that airs an episode containing cartoon violence on the same day that real violence occurs will be criticized. A network that pulls the episode will be praised for sensitivity. The calculation is straightforward, even if the logic is circular. The specific episode of Gumball that was delayed illustrates the absurdity and the sincerity of the process simultaneously. The content of the episode was not violent in any meaningful sense. It did not depict or glorify real-world harm. It did not reference the specific event that triggered the delay. The connection between the episode and the tragedy was thematic at best, coincidental at worst. But the network's decision to delay was not based on the actual content of the episode. It was based on the potential perception of the content, on what a headline might say, on what a screenshot might suggest, on the possibility that a single frame, removed from context and posted online with an inflammatory caption, might generate the kind of attention that no corporation wants. The delay created its own set of complications. The episode's place in the broadcast schedule had to be filled. Other episodes had to be rearranged. The delay affected international broadcast partners who had already scheduled the episode in their own territories. The ripple effect of a single scheduling decision, made in a conference room in Atlanta or Burbank on the day a tragedy occurred, extended across time zones and continents in ways that the people making the decision could not fully anticipate. And the episode, when it eventually aired weeks later, aired without comment. No explanation was offered for the delay. No context was provided. The episode simply appeared in the schedule on a different date, and the vast majority of the audience never knew it had been moved. The timing scandal reveals something about the fragility of scheduled entertainment that is easy to overlook. A television show exists not only as a piece of content, but as a piece of scheduling. It occupies a specific date, a specific time slot, a specific position in the cultural calendar. And the cultural calendar is unpredictable. No production team can anticipate which real-world events will make their fictional content suddenly uncomfortable. The show that airs on a quiet Tuesday is received differently than the same show airing on a Tuesday that follows a national tragedy. The content is identical. The context is transformed. And the transformation is entirely outside the show's control. The institutional memory that the timing scandal created within Cartoon Network's programming department was lasting. After the delay, the network implemented more systematic review procedures for episodes that contained content that might be perceived as sensitive in the context of real-world events. The procedures were not public. They were internal guidelines that shaped scheduling decisions in ways that you could not detect. An episode that in a previous era would have aired without review was now flagged for evaluation. The evaluation added time to the scheduling process. The added time created lag, and the lag, multiplied across dozens of episodes per season across multiple shows on the network, created a cumulative drag on the programming schedule that was invisible to viewers, but real to the people managing it. The fourth scandal also demonstrates how a single incident can reshape institutional behavior in ways that far outlast the incident itself. The episode that was delayed has been largely forgotten by the audience. Most fans could not name it. Most fans are unaware that any delay occurred, but the institutional procedures that the delay prompted remain in place, shaping scheduling decisions for shows that have no connection to the original incident. The scandal's visible manifestation was brief. Its institutional legacy is ongoing. The timing scandal also connects to a broader conversation about the relationship between fiction and violence that has been ongoing in media criticism for decades. The question of whether fictional violence can trigger real violence, or whether the consumption of violent fiction in proximity to real violence constitutes an act of insensitivity, is a question that the fourth scandal does not answer. The scandal does not prove anything about the relationship between fictional and real violence. What the scandal proves is that institutions believe the relationship exists, or at least believe that the public believes the relationship exists, and that the institutional belief, regardless of its accuracy, is sufficient to determine what the public sees and when the public sees it. The network's decision to delay the episode was made quickly. The timeline between the real-world event and the scheduling change was measured in hours rather than days. The speed of the decision suggests that the decision was not the product of careful analysis. It was the product of institutional reflex, the reflex to avoid association, the reflex to distance the brand from the event, the reflex to protect the network's reputation by removing anything that might generate negative association, regardless of whether the association was fair or logical or justified. The reflex is understandable. The reflex is also revealing. It reveals that institutional decision-making in times of crisis is driven by fear rather than by principle, by the desire to avoid negative outcomes rather than by the commitment to positive values. And the fear, which is the fourth scandal's driving force, which is the engine behind every scheduling change and every content delay, is a fear that has nothing to do with the show and nothing to do with the audience and everything to do with the institution's relationship with its own reputation. About the institutional calculation that avoidance is cheaper than explanation. About the choice to hide the content rather than defend it. The localization labor that preceded each international broadcast is itself a piece of scandal lore. Adapting a show for international audiences is not merely translation, it is cultural translation. Jokes that depend on English language wordplay must be reimagined in languages where the wordplay does not function. Cultural references that are immediately legible to a British or American audience must be replaced with references that are legible to a Japanese or Brazilian or Turkish audience. The localization teams, who are rarely credited and even more rarely discussed, perform acts of cultural mediation essential to the show's global reach, and entirely invisible to any individual viewer. You watch the show in your language and you assume the show was made in your language. You do not see the translation. You do not see the adaptation. You do not see the hundreds of creative decisions that were made to transform a show made in London into a show that feels native to your cultural context. The localization is hidden labor, and the hidden labor, when performed well, produces a show that feels locally created rather than internationally imported. The localization scandals are not dramatic. They are not headline generating. They are the accumulated friction of hundreds of small cultural mismatches, each one too minor to constitute a scandal on its own, but each one contributing to a larger pattern. A background sign in one episode uses a typeface that is associated in a specific territory with a specific political movement. A character's gesture in another episode has a meaning in a specific culture that the London production team did not intend. A color choice carries associations in a specific tradition that the show's designers were not aware of. Each mismatch is individually trivial. Each generates at most a minor complaint, but the accumulation creates a picture of a production that is constantly, inadvertently bumping against cultural boundaries that it cannot see from London. The economics of international distribution add another layer to this scandal. Not every territory generates equal revenue for Cartoon Network. The United States and the United Kingdom are the primary revenue drivers. Japan, Australia, and parts of Western Europe form a significant secondary tier. Markets in Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East generate less revenue per viewer but represent enormous potential audiences. the economics shape the editorial decisions in ways that are rarely discussed openly. When a scene might offend audiences in a lower revenue territory, the calculation is different than when that same scene might offend audiences in a higher revenue territory. The show does not say this. No production company says this. But the pattern of what gets changed and what does not reveals a hierarchy of cultural sensitivity that maps, with uncomfortable precision, onto a hierarchy of economic value. The territories that generate the most revenue for the network are the territories whose cultural sensitivities are least likely to trigger a modification. The territories that generate less revenue are the territories where modifications happen most freely, most quietly, and with the least internal resistance. This creates what might be called a chilling effect on creative ambition. When a writer in the room proposes a joke, the joke is evaluated not only for its comedic value and its appropriateness for the target audience, but also for its survivability across the distribution chain. A joke that works in the United Kingdom and the United States, but will be cut in 12 other territories, is a joke that generates production cost without generating universal value. The writer learns over time to anticipate the cuts, to preemptively soften, to avoid the territory that might generate a note from the standards department in Turkey, or a modification request from the broadcast partner in Indonesia. The self-censorship is invisible. It leaves no trace in the production records. It exists only as the absence of jokes that were never written, scenes that were never pitched, ideas that were never explored because the writer already knew they would not survive the journey from the writer's room in London to a television screen in Bangkok or Riyadh, or Buenos Aires. The specific examples of what changed across territories tell the story more precisely than the general pattern. In episodes involving physical affection between characters, including the kiss scene between Darwin and Carrie that generated controversy in several markets, the modifications ranged from complete removal to subtle re-editing. Some territories received versions where the kiss was replaced with a hug. Others received versions where the scene was shortened so dramatically that the emotional context was lost. A few territories received the scene intact, but with a content advisory that framed the moment as something requiring parental awareness. The same scene, experienced differently depending on where you happen to live, is the scandal in miniature. The show made one version of itself. The world received dozens. Religious imagery presented a particularly complex challenge. Episodes featuring supernatural elements, afterlife references, or anything that could be interpreted as commentary on religious belief were flagged differently in different territories. What was comedic in one market was potentially blasphemous in another. The production team could not predict every cultural flashpoint. They could not know that a background detail visible for 3 seconds in a single shot would generate a formal complaint in a territory they had never visited. The unpredictability of the offense, combined with the certainty that offense would occur somewhere, created an atmosphere of permanent editorial anxiety that shaped the show in ways you never saw. The fifth scandal was not one scandal. It was 100 small scandals, each one playing out in a different country, each one invisible to every other country, each one reshaping the show into a slightly different version of itself. The labor involved in managing international distribution at this scale is itself a hidden dimension of the scandal. Somewhere in the production pipeline, human beings sat in offices reviewing content against regulatory checklists for territories they had often never visited. They made judgments about cultural sensitivity using guidelines that were sometimes decades old, sometimes contradictory, sometimes based on assumptions about national character that bordered on stereotype. The people making these decisions were not villains. They were professionals performing a necessary function within a system that required their labor. But the cumulative effect of their decisions, the sum total of all the modifications and removals and substitutions, was a version of the show that no single person had designed and no single audience would ever see in its entirety. The international version of Gumball was not one show. It was dozens of shows, each missing different pieces, each carrying different silences where content had been removed. The question of whether the show's creative team had any meaningful control over the international modifications is a question about power within the production hierarchy. The writers and animators in London created one version of the show. The network's distribution arm created multiple versions. The creative team was consulted on major modifications, but not on every small cut or substitution. The small cuts, the ones that removed a gesture or shortened a reaction or replaced a background detail, accumulated without the creative team's full awareness. The show's creators discovered, sometimes months after an episode had aired in a particular territory, that their work had been altered in ways they had not approved. The dissonance between what the creators made and what the world received was the fifth scandal's emotional core. A creator who pours years of work into a project expects that project to reach its audience intact. The expectation is naive in the context of international distribution, but naivety does not diminish the emotional impact of discovering that your work has been modified without your knowledge. The modifications were individually small. A cut here, a substitution there, a shortened scene, a removed gesture, but the emotional weight of the modifications was cumulative. And the accumulation produced a specific kind of creative grief that does not have a name, but that anyone who has ever made something and watched it be changed by forces beyond their control will recognize immediately. The fifth scandal emerged from the show's relationship with international broadcast standards. Gumball airs in more than 120 countries, each with its own regulatory framework for children's television content. The regulatory frameworks differ significantly. What is acceptable in one country may be prohibited in another. And the show, which was produced in London for a global audience, had to navigate a landscape of conflicting standards that sometimes required contradictory responses. A joke that a European regulator approved might be flagged by an Asian regulator. A visual gag that passed in the Americas might be rejected in the Middle East. The show existed at the intersection of incompatible value systems, and the intersection produced scandals that were invisible to any single audience, but visible when the show's global broadcast history is examined as a whole. The most significant international scandal involved episodes that referenced or depicted religious imagery, cultural practices, or historical events that were sensitive in specific territories. The show's international approach to these sensitivities was inconsistent. Some episodes were proactively modified before broadcast in sensitive territories. Others were broadcast without modification and generated complaints after the fact. The inconsistency created a perception of carelessness, a sense that the show's production team did not fully understand or fully respect the cultural contexts in which their show was being received. The perception was not entirely fair. The production team was navigating a genuinely impossible task, creating a single show for more than 100 different cultural contexts. No single creative work can satisfy the standards of every culture simultaneously. Compromises are inevitable, and the compromises, which satisfied some audiences while offending others, which resolved some complaints while generating new ones, were the fifth scandal's defining characteristic. The show could not win. The show could not make everyone happy, and the impossibility of universal satisfaction is the fifth scandal's true subject. Not any specific cultural offense, not any specific regulatory failure, but the systemic impossibility of creating a single piece of entertainment that respects the values, the sensitivities, the cultural boundaries, and the regulatory requirements of every market on Earth simultaneously. The specific instances of international controversy range from the trivial to the significant. An episode that depicted a character eating a specific food generated complaints in territories where that food was associated with cultural practices that the show had inadvertently caricatured. An episode that included a background sign with text in a specific language generated complaints because the text, when translated, contained a phrase that was considered inappropriate in the language's cultural context. An episode that depicted a holiday celebration generated complaints in territories where that holiday was not observed or was observed differently. Each complaint was individually reasonable. Each complaint reflected a genuine cultural sensitivity that the show's production team, working in London, had not anticipated. And the accumulation of individually reasonable complaints produced a collective picture of a production that was simultaneously creating content for a global audience and struggling to understand what that global audience actually wanted. The production team's approach to international sensitivity evolved across the show's run. Early seasons show less awareness of international variations. Later seasons show more. The evolution suggests that the team learned from the complaints, that the scandals themselves served an educational function, that the friction between the show and its global audiences produced knowledge that the team incorporated into subsequent creative decisions. The learning did not eliminate the complaints. New episodes generated new sensitivities that the team had not anticipated. But the complaints became less frequent, and the diminishing, which represents the production team's growing sophistication about global cultural dynamics, is the fifth scandal's most constructive legacy. The show could only choose which audiences to prioritize and which to disappoint. And the choosing, which was sometimes made by the creative team and sometimes made by the network and sometimes made by local broadcasters operating independently, was the scandal. Not any single decision, but the accumulated weight of hundreds of decisions across hundreds of territories, each one representing a judgment about what matters and what does not, about which audiences deserve the unmodified show and which audiences receive the modified version. The sixth scandal was smaller in scale but sharper in focus, and it involved a specific accusation of plagiarism. A content creator, operating outside the show's production, publicly accused the show of copying visual elements, character designs, or story concepts from their own work. The accusation generated attention in the online spaces where Gumball fans and animation enthusiasts congregated. It generated debate. It generated the specific kind of digital controversy that thrives on incomplete information and strong opinions. The specifics of the accusation varied depending on who was telling the story. The accuser presented visual comparisons that showed similarities between their work and elements of the show. The show's defenders pointed out that similarities between animated works are common, that certain visual and narrative tropes recur across the medium, that resemblance is not the same as copying. The debate was never conclusively resolved. No legal action was taken. No official response was issued by the show's production team or by Cartoon Network. The accusation existed in the space of public discourse, where it generated heat without producing light, where it added to the show's scandal history without adding to the factual record. The plagiarism accusation is significant not because it was true, but because it illuminated the conditions under which accusations of plagiarism gained traction in the age of social media. A visual comparison posted to the right platform at the right moment can generate a controversy that persists long after the initial comparison has been evaluated and found inconclusive. The controversy becomes its own entity. It exists independently of the facts that generated it. It becomes part of the show's reputation, part of the show's history, part of the body of knowledge that fans carry about the show, regardless of whether the knowledge is accurate. The sixth scandal is a scandal about scandal itself. The plagiarism debate illuminated the specific conditions under which originality is evaluated in the animation industry. Animation is a collaborative medium with a long history of visual influence, reference, and stylistic borrowing. Character designs echo across studios and across decades. Visual tropes migrate from one show to another. Color palettes, compositional strategies, and character archetypes appear and reappear across the medium's history. The question of where influence ends and plagiarism begins is not one that the animation industry has ever definitively answered, and the absence of a definitive answer creates space for accusations that can be made with conviction but that cannot be resolved with certainty. The accuser in the sixth scandal presented side-by-side visual comparisons that showed genuine similarities. The similarities were real. The question was whether the similarities reflected copying, influence, convergent evolution, or coincidence. The animation industry is populated by artists who consume the same visual culture, who study the same predecessors, who absorb the same trends. The probability that two artists working independently will produce similar designs is higher than the public typically assumes. And the similarity, when it appears, when it is presented without context, when it is displayed as a side-by-side comparison on a social media platform optimized for outrage and engagement, looks like copying. It looks like theft. It looks like a large studio taking the work of an independent creator and using it without credit. The perception of theft persisted despite the absence of evidence. The accusation was never proven. The similarities were never demonstrated to be the result of copying rather than coincidence. But the accusation existed in the digital space where Gumball fans congregated, and its existence was enough to generate discussion, to create doubt, to add a question mark to the show's creative reputation. The question mark was never removed. Accusations in digital spaces do not have expiration dates. They persist, they are searchable, they appear in threads about the show years after they were first made, and their persistence is the sixth scandal's most instructive lesson about the permanence of digital controversy. A claim made once is a claim made forever. A visual comparison posted once is a visual comparison posted forever. The plagiarism scandal also raised questions about the animation industry's relationship with visual influence that the industry has never satisfactorily addressed. Animation is a medium built on reference. Animators study other animators. Storyboard artists study other storyboard artists. Character designers study other character designers. The studying produces influence. The influence produces similarity. And the similarity, when it crosses the line from influence to imitation, when it moves from inspiration to reproduction, creates the conditions for plagiarism accusations that the industry's norms of reference and influence make difficult to adjudicate. The Gumball production team, like all animation production teams, worked within a visual culture of shared reference. They watched other shows, they admired other shows, they were influenced by other shows. The influence was normal. It was professional. It was the standard creative practice of an industry built on shared visual traditions. But the normalcy of the influence did not protect the team from the accusation of plagiarism. The accusers saw similarity and interpreted it as copying. The team saw similarity and interpreted it as coincidence or a convergent influence. Both interpretations were plausible. neither was provable. And the impasse between the two interpretations, the inability to determine whether similarity reflects copying or coincidence, is the structural condition that makes plagiarism accusations in the animation industry simultaneously easy to make and impossible to resolve. The sixth scandal's aftermath produced changes in how the production team documented its creative process. Not because the team believed it had done anything wrong, but because the scandal demonstrated that the absence of documentation could be interpreted as the absence of independent creative process. The team began to more carefully record the sources of its inspiration, the development of its designs, the evolution of its ideas from concept to final form. The documentation was protective. It was insurance against future accusations. It was the bureaucratic response to a creative problem. And the bureaucratization, which is the sixth scandal's most tangible legacy, is a small but real diminishment of the creative process. Time spent documenting is time not spent creating. Energy spent protecting is energy not spent inventing. The scandal imposed a tax on the creative process, a documentation tax. A tax measured in hours and in energy and in the specific kind of creative momentum that bureaucratic requirements interrupt. The tax was small. The tax was reasonable. The tax was the cost of operating in a media environment where accusations can be made instantly and where the absence of defensive documentation can be interpreted as guilt. But the tax was real. And the reality of the tax, the small but measurable reduction in creative freedom that the sixth scandal produced, is a piece of scandal lore about the hidden costs of digital controversy. And the forever, which is the internet's most distinctive quality, which is the defining characteristic of digital information, transforms every accusation into an eternal accusation, every scandal into a scandal without end, about the way that accusations once made acquire a life of their own. The specific mechanics of how the accusations spread tell you as much about internet culture as they do about the show itself. The original post, which included side-by-side visual comparisons of the allegedly copied material, was designed for shareability. The images were cropped to maximize the apparent similarity, the context that might have complicated the accusation, the fact that both the show and the accuser were drawing on common visual traditions, the fact that the specific elements cited as stolen were also present in dozens of other animated properties was absent from the original post. The post traveled through social media platforms with the speed that only accusations travel. It was reshared, screenshotted, reposted with commentary that added certainty, where the original post had only implied it. Within days, the accusation had acquired the weight of established fact in certain online communities. Despite the fact that no formal legal claim had been filed and no independent analysis had been conducted. The show's response, or rather the absence of a formal response, became its own controversy. Cartoon Network did not issue a public statement addressing the accusation. The production team did not publish a rebuttal. The silence, which was almost certainly a strategic decision made by the network's legal and communications departments, was interpreted by the accuser's supporters as an admission of guilt. The logic was simple and wrong. If they had nothing to hide, they would have responded. The logic ignored the reality that corporations rarely respond to social media accusations because responding amplifies them, because any response can be quoted out of context, and because legal counsel almost universally advises silence in situations where no formal legal action has been initiated. The plagiarism accusation also highlighted a structural asymmetry in the relationship between large productions and individual creators. The show had resources, legal teams, institutional backing. The accuser had a social media account and a grievance. But in the economy of online attention, the accuser's position was stronger. The individual with a compelling accusation generates more engagement than the institution with a measured denial. The audience's sympathies naturally align with the smaller party. The narrative of the powerful stealing from the powerless is more satisfying, more shareable, and more emotionally resonant than the narrative of coincidental similarity. And so the accusation persisted. And persists in the show's online history as an unresolved blemish that formal analysis would likely dissolve, but that formal analysis has never been motivated to address. The convergent influence defense, which is the most compelling counterargument to the plagiarism accusation, deserves more detailed examination. The specific visual elements cited in the accusation, certain character poses, certain background compositions, certain color palette choices, were not unique to either the show or the accuser. They existed in a shared visual vocabulary that both parties had inherited from the same sources. The history of animation is a history of influence. Every character design draws on previous character designs. Every visual composition references compositions that came before it. The line between influence and theft is not a line at all. It is a gradient, and reasonable people can disagree about where on that gradient a specific instance falls. The accuser saw theft. The production team saw coincidence. And neither party was necessarily wrong because the question itself does not have a definitive answer. The documentation tax that the accusation imposed on the production was real even if invisible to the public. Internal communications about the matter, legal reviews of the specific claims, conversations about whether and how to respond, all consumed time and attention that could have been directed toward making the show. The accusation became a line item in the show's emotional budget, a recurring cost that generated no creative value. About the impossibility of fully refuting a claim in a media environment where claims travel faster than refutations, and where the accusation is always more interesting than the defense. The seventh scandal arrived in the middle of the show's run and involved the departure of key creative personnel from the production team. Staff turnover is normal in television production. People leave shows, people join shows. The creative team evolves across a series run, but specific departures from the Gumball production team generated attention and speculation because of the circumstances surrounding them. Departures that coincided with changes in the show's creative direction were interpreted by fans as evidence of internal conflict. The interpretation may or may not have been accurate. The internal dynamics of a production team are rarely visible to the public. What is visible is the result, the episodes that change, the quality that shifts, the tone that evolves, and the evolution which fans tracked with the attention that Gumball's audience brings to everything about the show was attributed to the departures, fairly or unfairly, accurately or inaccurately. The most discussed departure was Ben Bokelet's own exit from the show before its final season. Bokelet, who created the show, who guided its development, who defined its visual identity and its narrative philosophy, was not present for the show's conclusion. The circumstances of his departure are not fully documented in public sources. What is known is that the departure was not a simple creative choice. It involved the relationship between the creator and the network, the tensions between creative ownership and institutional control, the specific kind of friction that occurs when the person who made the thing and the institution that owns the thing disagree about what the thing should be. The departure left the show in the hands of other creative personnel who were talented and committed, but who were not the show's creator. The resulting episodes bear the mark of the transition. They are recognizably Gumball. They maintain the show's visual identity and narrative ambitions, but they carry a different energy, a different emphasis, a different relationship with the show's mythology and characters. The differences are subtle. They are visible only to viewers who have watched the preceding seasons with enough attention to internalize the show's creative rhythms. But the differences are there, and the differences are the seventh scandal's most lasting contribution to the show's history, the demonstration that a show and its creator are not the same thing, and that the separation of the two, whether voluntary or forced, leaves marks on both. The seventh scandal connects to a broader pattern in the animation industry that is rarely discussed publicly, but that is widely understood within the industry itself. Show creators frequently depart their own shows before those shows conclude. The departures are sometimes voluntary and sometimes not. They are sometimes the result of creative disagreements with the network, and sometimes the result of personal choices unrelated to the show. But regardless of the reason, the departure of a show's creator from their own show is always a rupture. It is always a wound. And the wound, whether it heals cleanly or leaves a scar, is always visible in the work. The specific impact of Bokelet's departure on Gumball's final episodes is a matter of interpretation rather than documented fact. No one from the production team or the network has publicly detailed the circumstances of the departure with enough specificity to support definitive conclusions. What is available is the work itself, the episodes that preceded the departure and the episodes that followed it, and the comparison, which is the only evidence available to the public, reveals differences that are real but that resist simple characterization. The post-departure episodes are not worse than the pre-departure episodes. They are different. They emphasize different aspects of the show's potential. They maintain the show's quality but shift its center of gravity, moving the emphasis from certain themes and tones to others. The show's audience detected the shift. Fan discussions during the show's final season frequently referenced a change in tone, a change in emphasis, a change in the way the show felt even though the specific changes were difficult to articulate. The feeling preceded the knowledge. Fans felt that something was different before they knew that Bokelet had departed. And the feeling, which was accurate, which was a correct perception of a real change, was produced by the accumulated effect of hundreds of small creative decisions that individually were imperceptible but that collectively altered the show's emotional signature. The seventh scandal raises uncomfortable questions about authorship and institutional ownership that the animation industry prefers not to address publicly. Who owns a show? The person who created it, the studio that produces it, the network that broadcasts it, The legal answer is clear. The studio and the network own the show. The creator typically works under a contract that assigns ownership to the production company and the broadcaster. But the creative answer is different from the legal answer. The creator's vision defined the thing. The creator's sensibility determined what the thing feels like, how the thing operates, what the thing means. And when the creator departs, the vision does not transfer with the contract. The vision is personal. The vision is embodied. The vision lives in the creator's taste, in the creator's instincts, in the specific way the creator responds to a script or a design or a performance. The vision cannot be documented. It cannot be transferred. It can only be approximated. And the approximation, no matter how skilled, no matter how dedicated, no matter how respectful of the original vision, is always an approximation. It is always one step removed from the thing it is approximating. And the step, which is the distance between the creator and the inheritors, is the seventh scandal's most permanent consequence. The step is visible, the step is felt, and the step is the proof that a show and its creator, despite the legal separation, are never fully separable. The show carries its creator's fingerprints. The removal of the creator does not remove the fingerprints. It only makes the fingerprints historical rather than active, past rather than present, memory rather than practice. The seventh scandal also raises the question of sustainability. Show creation is, in many cases, an act of self-destruction. The creator pours their vision, their energy, their attention, their emotional resources into the show. And the pouring is not sustainable indefinitely. Shows consume their creators. They demand constant creative output. They demand decisions about every element of every episode, from the largest narrative choice to the smallest visual detail. The demand is relentless. It does not pause. It does not offer recovery time. And the relentlessness, which is a structural feature of television production rather than a flaw that can be corrected, creates conditions under which creator departures are not anomalies but inevitabilities. The question is not whether the creator will depart. The question is when. And the when, which is determined by the intersection of the creator's resources and the show's demands, is the seventh scandal's most practical lesson. Shows outlast their creators. Shows consume the energy that created them. Shows are, in a very specific sense, parasitic. They feed on the vision that conceived them. And when the vision is exhausted, the show continues anyway, feeding now on the vision's memory rather than on the vision itself. The other creative departures that accompanied or followed Baccalet's exit are less discussed but equally significant. Writers who had been with the show since its early seasons departed. Storyboard artists who had defined the show's visual language moved on to other projects. Voice directors whose interpretations of the characters had become integral to the show's identity were replaced by directors with different instincts. Each departure removed a piece of the institutional knowledge that had accumulated over years of collaborative production. The knowledge was not documented. It could not be documented. It was embodied knowledge. It lived in the habits and instincts and creative reflexes of the people who carried it. And when those people left, the knowledge left with them. The show retained its scripts and its design documents and its production bibles and its style guides. But it lost the thing that the documents could not capture: the feel, the specific, ineffable, undocumentable quality of knowing how this show works at the level of instinct rather than instruction. The fan community's response to the creative departures was divided. Some fans noticed the changes and attributed them correctly to the loss of key creative personnel. Other fans noticed the changes but attributed them to the show's natural evolution, to the aging of the series, to the inevitable diminishment that all long-running shows experience. The attribution matters because it determines the story. If the changes are attributed to departures, the story is one of institutional failure. If the changes are attributed to natural evolution, the story is one of creative life cycle. The seventh scandal is both stories simultaneously. The departures were institutional failures. They were also natural evolutions. The creative team that made the show's early seasons could not have made the show's later seasons even if they had stayed, because the creative team had changed by the act of making the show. The show changed them. The experience of producing hundreds of episodes altered their creative instincts, their aesthetic preferences, their relationship with the material. The departures removed people who had already been changed by the work, and the replacement personnel who arrived fresh, who had not been changed by the specific experience of making this specific show, brought a different kind of energy. Not better or worse. Different. And the different, which is the seventh scandal's permanent mark on the show's history, is a fact about creative work that the scandal makes visible, but that is present in every long-running creative project. Everything changes. Everyone leaves. The work continues. And the continuation, which is the work's survival, is always purchased at the cost of the work's original identity. The show carries its creator's fingerprints. The removal of the creator does not remove the fingerprints. It only makes the fingerprints historical rather than active, past rather than present, memory rather than practice. The 8th scandal crossed the boundary between the show and its fan community, and it involved the show's relationship with fan-created content. The Gumball fan community is active, creative, and prolific. It produces fan art, fan fiction, fan animation, and fan commentary that extends the show's universe beyond its official boundaries. The relationship between the show and its fan community was generally positive. The show acknowledged its fans. The show incorporated fan energy into its creative process. The show benefited from the engagement that the fan community provided. But the relationship had boundaries, and the 8th scandal involved a moment when those boundaries were tested. Fan content that crossed into territory that the show's creators or the network considered inappropriate generated a response that the fan community perceived as heavy-handed. The specifics varied. In some cases, the response involved takedown notices for fan content that was deemed to infringe on the show's intellectual property. In other cases, the response involved public statements from people associated with the production that expressed discomfort with the direction that certain segments of the fan community had taken. The responses, regardless of their specific form, created friction between the show and its most dedicated audience. The institutional knowledge that departed with each member of the creative team was irreplaceable in ways that the replacement process could not fully address. A new writer could learn the show's format, study the existing scripts, understand the character dynamics on an intellectual level. But the intuitive understanding of how far a joke could go, of which character combinations produced best comedic chemistry, of which visual gags had been considered and rejected in previous seasons, that understanding lived only in the minds of the people who had been there from the beginning. The loss of that institutional knowledge manifested in subtle ways that attentive viewers detected. A joke that felt slightly off, a character reaction that was almost right but not quite, a narrative choice that a previous season would have made differently. The differences were small enough to be dismissed individually, but cumulative enough to change the show's texture when viewed across an entire season. The 7th scandal also raised questions about the sustainability of creative work in the animation industry. The production schedule for an animated series is grueling. The compensation, while competitive within the industry, is not commensurate with the emotional and creative investment required to produce work at the level that Gumball demanded. Burnout is common. Career pivots are common. The departure of key personnel was not a failure of loyalty. It was a natural consequence of a system that asks individuals to pour themselves into collaborative projects for years at a time without guaranteeing that the project will continue, that their contributions will be recognized, or that the creative direction will remain aligned with their vision. Bokelet's own departure, which occurred before the show's final season, was the most significant of the 7 scandal's events. The creator of the show choosing to leave before its conclusion raised questions that the fan community debated extensively. Was the departure voluntary, or was it the result of creative differences with the network? Was the show that continued after his departure still his show? Could a show survive the loss of its creator and retain its essential identity? The answers depended entirely on what you believed the essential identity of the show to be. The episodes produced after Bokelet's departure are the evidence that the fan community uses to argue both sides of this question. Some of these episodes are among the show's strongest. Some feel subtly different in ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The writing remains sharp, the animation remains inventive, but something in the show's center of gravity shifts. A sensibility that was present in earlier seasons, a specific quality of observation that belonged to one person's way of seeing the world, becomes diluted. Not absent. Diluted, the show continues to function. It continues to produce episodes that are funny and strange and occasionally profound, but the frequency of the profundity changes. The ratio of jokes to observations shifts. The show becomes, in the assessment of some viewers, a very good version of itself rather than an irreplaceable one. The 7 scandals' lasting effect on the show's production was the establishment of a new creative equilibrium that was sustainable in ways the original configuration was not. The original team, built around a single creator's vision and staffed by people who had been with the show from the beginning, was brilliant but fragile. One departure could destabilize the entire operation. The reconfigured team, built around institutional processes and staffed by talented people who were committed to the show's identity, even if they had not been present at its creation, was less volatile and less dependent on any single individual. The trade-off was a subtle reduction in the show's capacity for surprise. The reconfigured team was excellent at executing the show's established strengths. It was less likely to produce the moments of unexpected brilliance that had characterized the show at its peak under Bokelet's direct supervision. The friction produced anger, disappointment, and the specific kind of betrayal that fans experience when the thing they love appears to reject their love. The eighth scandal is a scandal about the boundary between creator and audience, about who owns the meaning of a show, about whether the people who make a thing retain control over how that thing is interpreted, discussed, and reimagined by the people who consume it. The show's position, implicit in its responses, was that the creators retain a degree of control. The fan community's position, implicit in their reaction, was that consumption creates its own kind of ownership. The two positions are irreconcilable. They represent fundamentally different understandings of the relationship between art and audience. And the irreconcilability, which is the eighth scandal's true subject, is a scandal that extends far beyond Gumball, far beyond animation, far beyond any single show or any single fandom. It is the scandal of all creative work in the digital age, the impossibility of controlling how your creation is received. The eighth scandal's specific incidents are difficult to document with precision because they occurred in digital spaces, where the records are incomplete and where the narratives are contested. Fan communities are not monolithic. They are composed of individuals with different values, different boundaries, and different understandings of what constitutes appropriate engagement with a creative work. The segments of the fan community that generated the controversy were not representative of the fan community as a whole. They were outliers. They were the extreme edge of a spectrum of engagement that, for most fans, remained within boundaries that the show's creators would have found acceptable or even gratifying. But the outliers were visible. In digital spaces, the extreme is always more visible than the moderate. The content that pushes boundaries attracts more attention than the content that respects them. The fan art that provokes generates more engagement than the fan art that celebrates. And the visibility of the extreme, which is a structural feature of digital platforms, rather than a reflection of the fan community's actual composition, created a perception of the fan community that was skewed toward its most controversial elements. The show's creators and the network responded to the perception rather than to the reality. They responded to what was visible rather than to what was representative. And the response, which was directed at the extreme rather than at the whole, was experienced by the whole as a rejection. The moderate fans, who constituted the vast majority of the community, felt the weight of a response that was not aimed at them but that affected them nonetheless. The dynamic between the show and its fan community stabilized over time. But the eighth scandal left residual distrust that persisted throughout the remainder of the show's run and beyond. The distrust is visible in fan discussions about the show's relationship with its audience. It is visible in the protective language that fans use when discussing their creative engagement with the show. It is visible in the expectation, which did not exist before the eighth scandal, that the show might turn against its own audience at any moment. It was the product of a single incident extrapolated into a pattern. It was the product of a community that had been hurt once and that, having been hurt, could not fully trust again. The distrust is not unique to Gumball's fan community. It is a structural feature of fan communities in the digital age, where every interaction between a show and its fans is public, where every response is visible, where every perceived slight is documented and shared and amplified by the network effects of social media platforms that reward engagement over accuracy. The deeper dynamics of the eighth scandal involve the question of interpretive authority. Who decides what the show means? The creators, who made it? The audience, who watched it? The institutions, who own it? The question has no answer that satisfies all parties. The creators believe that the show means what they intended it to mean. The audience believes that the show means what they experience it to mean. The institutions believe that the show means whatever generates the most value. And the three meanings, which are different, which sometimes contradict each other, which cannot be reconciled into a single coherent interpretation, coexist in the cultural space around the show, generating the friction that is the eighth scandal. Fan-created content that reimagines the show's characters in contexts that the show itself would never explore is an act of creative engagement that serves multiple functions simultaneously. It is an expression of love. It is an assertion of ownership. It is an act of creative partnership between the audience and the show. It is also, from the perspective of the show's creators and the show's institutional owners, a potential brand risk, a reputational liability, a creative interpretation that might be attributed to the show itself by audiences who do not distinguish between official and unofficial content. The tension between creative partnership and brand risk is irresolvable. It is the permanent condition of fan culture in the digital age. And the permanence, which means that the tension will never be resolved, which means that the eighth scandal will never truly end, is the scandal's final form. It is not an event. It is a state. It is the ongoing, permanent, irresolvable negotiation between the people who make things and the people who love them. The takedown notices that Cartoon Network issued against fan works became flashpoints in this broader conflict. Fan artists who had spent dozens of hours creating work inspired by the show received automated or semi-automated notices informing them that their work violated copyright. The notices were legally defensible. The show's characters, designs, and narrative elements are the intellectual property of Cartoon Network and its affiliates. But the emotional impact of receiving a takedown notice for work created out of love, work that generated no revenue and served primarily to keep the show alive in the cultural conversation during breaks between seasons, was devastating to the individuals involved and corrosive to the community's relationship with the network. The takedown notices said, in the language of corporate law, what the fan community heard as a personal rejection, your love for this show is not welcome in this form. The community's internal response to the takedown controversy was not unified. Some fans argued that the network was within its rights and that fan creators should accept the legal reality. Others argued that fan creation is a form of free expression that benefits the show by maintaining audience engagement. Others took more extreme positions, arguing that the network's enforcement of copyright against its own fans was evidence of corporate hostility toward the audience. The divisions within the community, which had existed before the controversy but had remained largely invisible, became visible and sharp. The scandal was not just about the show and its fans, it was about the fans and each other, about whose interpretation of the situation was correct, about whose loyalty to the show was more authentic, about whether defending the network made you a reasonable person or a traitor to the community. The social media dimension of the fan friction scandal added velocity and permanence to conflicts that might otherwise have dissipated. A disagreement that in a previous era would have played out in a message board thread and been forgotten within a week was instead screenshot captured, reposted across platforms, commented on by thousands of people with no direct involvement, and preserved in the permanent record of the internet. The fan community's internal conflicts became entertainment for external observers. The spectacle of fans arguing about the show became, for some audiences, more engaging than the show itself. The Eighth Scandal's resolution, to the extent that it had won, came not through a single decisive event but through the gradual exhaustion of the conflict's participants. The fan community's internal divisions softened over time, not because the underlying disagreements were resolved, but because the energy required to sustain them diminished. People moved on. New shows attracted new fandoms. The intensity of the friction, which had been fueled by the show's ongoing production, and the sense that the stakes of the argument were real and present, diminished as the show approached its conclusion. The friction did not disappear. It became ambient. It became the background hum of a community that had argued so fiercely about its shared object of love that the arguments had become part of the community's identity. The relationship between the show's creators and the fan community in the years following the friction scandal was characterized by a cautious warmth. The creators acknowledged the fan community's passion and dedication. The fan community acknowledged the creators' right to make creative decisions. But the memory of the friction, the memory of the takedown notices, and the interpretive battles and the social media conflicts remained present in the relationship. The warmth was real. The caution was also real. And the coexistence of warmth and caution, which is the coexistence of love and the memory of pain, is the Eighth Scandal's most enduring legacy. The Eighth Scandal also illuminated the power dynamics within fan communities themselves. The controversy was not merely between the show and its fans, it was between different factions within the fan community, factions that held different views about appropriate engagement, about creative boundaries, about what the show's world could and should contain. The factions argued with each other as intensely as they argued with the show. The arguments were passionate. They were sometimes cruel. They were conducted in digital spaces where the normal social constraints that moderate face-to-face disagreement were absent. And the cruelty, which was the product of passion and anonymity, and the specific disinhibition that digital platforms produce, was itself a piece of scandal. The fan community, which was united in its love for the show, was divided in its understanding of what that love permitted. And the division, which was painful, which alienated fans from each other, which created factions and grudges and the specific kind of persistent digital hostility that poisons online communities, was a consequence of the intensity of the community's engagement. They argued because they cared. They fought because the show mattered to them. And the mattering, which was the source of the community's energy and the source of its pain, was the Eighth Scandal's deepest irony. The show's greatest achievement, making people care, was also the source of the show's most damaging scandal. The expectation was not fully rational. The show's overall relationship with its fan community was positive, supportive, and genuinely appreciative. But the Eighth Scandal demonstrated that the relationship had limits. And the demonstration of limits in a relationship that fans had assumed was limitless was a form of betrayal that the rational assessment of the overall relationship could not fully heal. The ninth scandal involved the show's ending. The Inquisition, the show's final episode, ended without resolution. The story was not completed. The narrative threads that the show had been weaving across 6 seasons were not tied. The characters were left in a state of transformation, caught between what they were and what they were becoming, suspended in a moment of change that the show did not see through to completion. The ending felt like an interruption rather than a conclusion. It felt like the show had been stopped rather than ended. The fan response was immediate, intense, and sustained. Petitions were created calling for additional episodes. Social media campaigns were launched demanding that Cartoon Network complete the story. The incomplete ending became the show's most discussed creative decision, and the discussion invariably returned to the same question: was the ending a creative choice or an institutional imposition? Did the show's creators intend to end the story in media res, or did the network's decision to end the show prevent the creators from completing the story they had planned? The answer, based on available information, appears to be somewhere between the two. The creative team appears to have known that the show was ending. They appear to have constructed the final episodes with the knowledge that these would be the last. But the shape of the ending, the specific degree of irresolution, the particular quality of incompleteness, suggests that the ending they delivered was not the ending they originally envisioned. The ending was a compromise between the story the creators wanted to tell and the number of episodes the network was willing to produce. And the compromise, like all compromises, satisfied nobody fully. The creators did not get to finish their story. The audience did not get to see the story finished. And the network, which presumably wanted a clean conclusion that would simplify syndication and merchandising, did not get that either. The ninth scandal is a scandal about endings, about who controls them, about the gap between the ending you want and the ending you get, about the specific cruelty of a story that promises resolution and delivers suspension. The ninth scandal's emotional weight is compounded by the specific nature of the show's unresolved ending. The Inquisition transforms the characters from animated to realistic, strips away the visual protection that animation provides, and then ends. The ending is a cliff. It is a narrative that walks to the edge of its own abyss and then stops. The characters are caught in transformation. They are neither what they were nor what they are becoming. They are frozen in the moment of change, and the freezing is permanent because no subsequent episode exists to unfreeze them. The characters will remain in that moment forever. They will remain caught between forms, between realities, between the animated world that protected them and the realistic world that threatens them, for as long as the show exists in the memories of the people who watched it. The fan response to the ending generated its own ecosystem of engagement. Theories proliferated about what would have happened next, about how the story would have concluded if the show had been given additional episodes. The theories are elaborate. They are detailed. They are the product of the same sustained, careful attention that fans have always brought to the show. And the theories, which are unprovable, which exist in the space of imagination, rather than in the space of confirmed narrative, are the ending's most lasting consequence. The ending that was not provided by the show was provided by the audience. The resolution that the show refused to deliver was delivered by the people who needed it. The fans completed the story. The fans resolved the narrative. And the resolution, which is fan-generated rather than show-generated, which is imagined rather than produced, which is personal rather than institutional, is the only resolution that exists. The ninth scandal gave the fans the only gift that an incomplete ending can give: the freedom to imagine the ending themselves. The petition campaigns that demanded the show's continuation were significant not because they were successful, but because they demonstrated the intensity of the audience's attachment. The campaigns collected signatures. They generated media coverage. They demonstrated that the show's audience was willing to invest time and effort in the pursuit of additional episodes. The campaigns did not produce additional episodes. The institutional decision to end the show was not reversed by fan petition, but the campaigns contributed to the cultural pressure that eventually produced the movie announcement. The fans did not get more episodes, but the fans demonstrated that the demand for more episodes was real, and the demonstration was heard, and the hearing eventually produced a response. The relationship between the fan campaigns and the movie announcement is not direct. It is not causal in the simple sense, but it is connected. The campaigns created a context in which a continuation was commercially viable. The campaigns demonstrated a market, and the market, which is the language that institutions speak, was the argument that eventually persuaded the institution to continue the story. But before the movie announcement offered hope, there were years of silence. Years where the ending of the Inquisition was the ending of the show, full stop. And during those years, the fan community did what fan communities do when they are given an unfinished story. They finished it themselves. They wrote theories, they drew conclusions, they constructed elaborate narrative architectures out of the fragments the show had left behind, building possible resolutions the way archaeologists reconstruct pottery from shards. Some of these fan theories were elegant, some were absurd, some were more satisfying than anything the official production might have delivered, and the existence of these fan theories, their proliferation and their sophistication became its own kind of scandal. Because the theories revealed what the audience wanted. They revealed the emotional investments the show had cultivated over 6 seasons. They revealed that the audience was not simply consuming content but participating in it, co-authoring a story that the official creators had abandoned mid-sentence. The petition campaigns that followed the finale were significant in their scale. Tens of thousands of signatures gathered across multiple platforms, all making the same request: finish the story. The petitions were polite mostly. They were earnest. They were the digital equivalent of a crowd standing outside a theater after the curtain has fallen, asking for one more act. And the petitions revealed something about the relationship between audience and institution that the show itself had been exploring for years. The audience believed they had a right to resolution. The institution believed it had a right to cancellation. And neither side was entirely wrong. The show's creator, Ben Bocklett, occupied an unusual position in this conflict. He had chosen to end the show with the Inquisition. The cliffhanger was deliberate, the ambiguity was intentional, but the context of the ending, the fact that it aired as the final episode of the final season, transformed the ambiguity from a creative choice into something that felt like a betrayal. A cliffhanger in the middle of a season is a promise. A cliffhanger at the end of a series is a broken promise. And the distinction matters because the audience's emotional response to the two situations is fundamentally different. The mid-season cliffhanger generates excitement. The series finale cliffhanger generates grief. The grief was real. It was expressed in comment sections and forums and social media posts that described the feeling of watching the Inquisition for the first time without knowing it was the end. Some viewers described a physical sensation of wrongness. Something is missing. Something was taken. The language of the fan response borrowed from the language of loss. And the borrowing was not melodramatic. It was accurate. Because the show had built a world that felt complete. A world with internal logic and emotional consistency. And characters who changed over time. And then it had removed the audience from that world without warning and without closure. The removal was the scandal. The silence that followed the removal was the scandal's echo. The years between the finale and the movie announcement were years of active mourning and active hope existing simultaneously. The fan community kept the show alive through analysis, through rewatches, through the kind of sustained attention that normally dissipates within months of a show's conclusion. The fact that the attention did not dissipate, that the community continued to grow even after the show stopped producing new content, was itself evidence of how deeply the unfinished ending had embedded itself in the audience's consciousness. An ending that resolves cleanly allows the audience to move on. An ending that refuses resolution, the specific narrative architecture of the Inquisition, made the lack of resolution particularly painful. The episode did not simply end on an unresolved note. It ended on a note that actively destroyed the show's established reality. Characters were transformed. The rules that had governed the show's universe for 6 seasons were broken. The familiar became unfamiliar. And then the screen went dark. The destruction of the familiar was the cliffhanger's cruelest element, because it meant that the audience could not even return to the show as it had been. The world they had spent 6 seasons inhabiting was gone, replaced by something threatening and unrecognizable, and no subsequent episode existed to restore it. The fan theories that attempted to resolve the Inquisition's cliffhanger reveal, in their variety and their desperation, the different ways an audience processes narrative abandonment. Some theories propose that the events of the Inquisition were a dream or a simulation, a reading that would restore the status quo and make the cliffhanger's destruction temporary. Others propose that the Inquisition represented the show's transition to a darker, more mature narrative phase that would have been explored in subsequent seasons. Others proposed that the cliffhanger was metatextual, that the show was commenting on its own cancellation by depicting the destruction of its own universe. Each theory was an attempt to impose meaning on an absence of meaning. Each theory was an act of creative repair performed by an audience that had been handed a broken story and could not leave it broken. The question of whether the unfinished ending was a creative choice or an institutional failure remains contested. Bocklett has suggested in interviews that the ending was deliberate, that the ambiguity was the point. But the institutional context, the fact that the show's future was uncertain when the Inquisition was produced, complicates the claim of pure creative intentionality. A creator who knows their show might be cancelled makes different choices than a creator who knows their show will continue. The uncertainty infects the creative process in ways that are difficult to separate from the final product, and the audience, unable to know which decisions were creative and which were pragmatic, is left to interpret an ending that may not have a single coherent interpretation. The 10th scandal is the one that is still happening. It is the scandal of the show's legacy, the ongoing negotiation between what the show was and what the show means, between the thing that was produced and the thing that persists in the memories and the conversations and the creative practices of the people who watched it. The legacy scandal is not a single event, it is a process. It is the slow, continuous, unresolved process by which a show becomes a cultural artifact, by which the thing that was made for entertainment becomes the thing that is studied, analyzed, celebrated, criticized, and remembered. The legacy scandal involves the movie. The announcement that a Gumball movie was in development generated excitement, speculation, anxiety, and the specific kind of protective possessiveness that fans develop toward shows that they consider theirs. The movie represents a continuation. It represents a resolution. It represents the possibility that the quizzitation left unfinished might finally be completed. But it also represents a risk. The risk that the movie will not be good enough. The risk that the movie will not honor the show's legacy. The risk that the movie will be made by people who do not understand the show, or who understand it differently from the fans, or who prioritize commercial considerations over creative ones. The movie has not yet been released. Its quality is unknown. Its relationship to the show's existing mythology is unclear. And the uncertainty, which is the current state of the legacy scandal, which is the space in which the show's fans currently live, is itself a piece of scandal. Because uncertainty is painful. Because not knowing is harder than knowing. Because the space between announcement and release, between promise and delivery, between hope and reality, is the space where anxiety lives. And the anxiety is appropriate. Because the show matters. Because the show, as this video has demonstrated across 10 scandals, as the evidence has established across 2 hours of investigation, is a creative achievement that deserves a legacy commensurate with its quality. The show was built with care. It was built with ambition. It was built by people who understood what they were making, and who fought sometimes against their own network, sometimes against their own audience, sometimes against the constraints of their own medium, to make the thing they believed in. The scandals are the evidence of the fighting. They are the marks that the fighting left. They are the places where the show's ideals and the world's realities collided. And the collisions produced friction, and the friction produced heat. And the heat produced the specific kind of damage that all creative work sustains when it moves from the protected space of imagination into the contested space of public life. But before we reach the survival, it is worth pausing to consider what the 10 scandals taken together reveal about the ecosystem in which animated television is produced. The first scandal revealed the legal infrastructure of creative ownership. The second revealed the ethical complications of using reality as a creative resource. The third revealed the cultural politics of content in children's media. The fourth revealed the contextual vulnerability of fiction. The fifth revealed the impossibility of universal cultural sensitivity. The sixth revealed the permanence of digital accusation. The seventh revealed the irreplaceability of creative vision. The eighth revealed the irreconcilable tension between creator and audience. The ninth revealed the institutional power to end stories before they are finished. And the 10th revealed the impossibility of controlling how a show is remembered. Each scandal operated in a different domain: legal, ethical, cultural, political, industrial, digital, creative, institutional. But the scandals share a common structure. In every case, the show's creative ambitions collided with external forces that the creative team could not control. In every case, the collision produced consequences that the audience was not fully informed about. In every case, the consequences were absorbed into the show's history, becoming part of the record without becoming part of the narrative. The scandals are the show's secret history. They are the events that shaped the show from the outside, that determined what the show could be and what it could not be, that drew the boundaries within which the show's creative freedom operated. The secret history matters because it changes how you understand the show. When you know about the legal disputes over character ownership, you understand the characters differently. They are not merely creative inventions. They are survivors of a legal process that eliminated their predecessors. When you know about the content modifications, you understand the episodes differently. They are not merely entertainment. They are compromised versions of more complete original visions. When you know about the creator's departure, you understand the final season differently. It is not merely the end of a show, it is the end of a specific creative vision replaced by a different creative vision that inherited the first vision's world, without inheriting its complete perspective. The scandals also reveal the extent to which every piece of animated television is a compromise. Not just Gumball. Every show, Every series that airs on a network that is produced by a studio, that is broadcast in multiple territories, that is subject to content review and regulatory oversight. And institutional decision-making is a compromise between what the creative team wants to make and what the institutional structure allows them to make. The compromise is invisible. It is hidden behind the polished final product, behind the clean animation and the clear voice work and the seamless compositing. The product looks intentional. The product looks complete. The product looks like exactly what the creators intended to make. But it is not. It is what the creators were allowed to make. And the gap between intention and allowance, between the show that was imagined and the show that was produced, is the space where all 10 scandals live. The knowledge of this gap does not diminish the show. It deepens the show. It transforms the experience of watching from a passive consumption of entertainment into an active engagement with a creative work that was produced under conditions of constraint, compromise, and conflict. The show that you watch is a show that fought for its own existence. It fought against legal obstacles. It fought against privacy complaints. It fought against content censors. It fought against bad timing. It fought against cultural incomprehension. It fought against plagiarism accusations. It fought against staff departures. It fought against its own audience. It fought against an ending that was not the ending it wanted. And it fought for a legacy that it could not control. The fighting is the scandal. And the scandal is the show. The show survived its scandals. It survived the legal disputes over character ownership. It survived the privacy complaints about photographic backgrounds. It survived the content controversies and the timing sensitivities and the international broadcast complications and the plagiarism accusations and the staff departures and the fan community friction and the incomplete ending. It survived because the work was strong enough to sustain damage, because the creative foundation was solid enough to support the weight of institutional conflict. The 10th scandal is the ongoing scandal of evaluation. The process by which the show's place in animation history is determined, the arguments about where the show ranks among its contemporaries, the debates about whether the show fulfilled its potential or fell short of it, the disagreements about which seasons are strongest and which are weakest and which episodes are essential and which are dispensable. All of this evaluation constitutes a scandal because evaluation is always contested. There is no consensus about what Gumball is. There is no agreement about what it means. There is no settled verdict on its quality, its legacy, its importance. And the absence of consensus, which is the permanent condition of all cultural evaluation, is the 10th scandal's defining characteristic. The show is still being argued about. The show is still being debated. The show is still being discovered by new audiences who bring new perspectives and new expectations and new standards of judgment. And the discovery, which is ongoing, which will continue for as long as the show is available for viewing, ensures that the 10th scandal will never be resolved. The evaluation will never conclude. The legacy will never be settled. The meaning will never be fixed. The show's cultural context continues to evolve in ways that change the meaning of the work itself. Episodes that were unremarkable at the time of their initial broadcast become significant in retrospect as the cultural conversations they engaged with evolve. The LGBTQ representation that was controversial in 2014 is now evaluated in the context of a media landscape that has moved significantly toward greater inclusion. The economic commentary that was implicit in the show's portrayal of the Wattersons' financial struggles is now evaluated in the context of a global economic conversation about inequality that has become more urgent and more explicit. The show's meaning changes because the world changes, and the changing meaning is the 10th scandal's most important insight. The show is not fixed. The show is alive. The show is a living document that means different things at different times to different people. And the living, which is the quality that distinguishes art from product, which is the quality that transforms entertainment into culture, is the reason the scandals matter. The scandals are the evidence that the show is alive. The scandals are the friction that a living thing produces when it moves through a living world. And the friction, which is uncomfortable, which is sometimes painful, which is always more interesting than smooth passage, is the proof that the show was real. That the show engaged with reality rather than avoiding it. That the show said things that mattered enough to generate disagreement. And the disagreement, which is the 10th scandal, which is the scandal that will never end, is the show's most enduring achievement. The show made people care enough to argue. And the arguing, which continues tonight, which continues in this video, which will continue long after this video is over, is the legacy. The scandal is the legacy. The friction is the art. The legacy scandal connects to a broader question about the preservation of animated television in the digital age. Shows like Gumball exist in multiple versions. The broadcast versions differ by territory. The streaming versions may differ from the broadcast versions. The versions available on physical media may differ from both. And the differences, which are the product of the censorship history, the localization history, the institutional decision-making history that constitutes the show's scandal history, create a preservation challenge that is unique to television produced in the era of global broadcast and territorial modification. Which version of Gumball is the definitive version? The version that aired in the United Kingdom, where the show was produced. The version that aired in the United States, where the network was headquartered. The version that is currently available on streaming platforms, which may include modifications that were not present in either the original UK or US broadcasts. The question has no satisfactory answer, and the absence of an answer is the legacy scandal's most practical consequence. The show cannot be definitively preserved because the show does not definitively exist. It exists in versions, it exists in variants, it exists in a multiplicity of forms that resist the reduction to a single authoritative text. The academic and critical engagement with the show adds another dimension to the legacy scandal. Gumball has been the subject of scholarly analysis that examines its visual innovation, its philosophical content, its social commentary, and its significance within the history of animated television. The academic attention validates the show. It confirms that the show is worthy of sustained intellectual engagement. But the academic attention also complicates the show. It adds interpretive layers that the show's creators may not have intended. It identifies themes and patterns that may be the product of analytical projection rather than authorial intention. The question of whether the meanings that scholars find in the show were placed there by the creators or created by the analysis is a question that the legacy scandal keeps open. The show means what the scholars say it means. The show also means what the creators say it means. And the two meanings may not be the same. And the difference, if there is a difference, is the space in which the legacy scandal lives. The movie announcement transformed the legacy scandal from a retrospective conversation into a prospective one. The conversation is no longer only about what the show was. It is now also about what the show will become. The movie represents a continuation. It represents a return. It represents the possibility that the unresolved ending, the ninth scandal's wound, might finally receive the attention it requires. But the movie also represents a risk. The risk of disappointment. The risk of inadequacy. The risk that the continuation will not live up to the original. The risk that the return will reveal that the thing that was loved cannot be recaptured. The movie changes the stakes of the legacy scandal. Before the movie, the legacy was fixed. The show was over. The meaning was settled, or at least settling. After the movie announcement, the legacy is in motion again. The meaning is unsettled again. And the unsettling, which is the movie's gift and its threat, is the legacy scandal's current chapter. The chapter that is being written right now. The chapter that this video, in its own small way, is contributing to. The preservation challenges facing the show are a dimension of the legacy scandal that receives almost no attention but may prove to be the most consequential over time. Animated television exists in a peculiar relationship with archival permanence. The episodes themselves are preserved in the network's library, presumably in perpetuity, but the production materials, the thousands of individual assets that were created in the process of making the show, are not preserved with the same care. Character model sheets, background art files, animation rigs, storyboard revisions, notes from creative meetings, email chains where key decisions were made. These materials exist in digital formats on servers and hard drives that are subject to the same decay and obsolescence that threaten all digital archives. The show that is preserved is the finished product. The process that produced the show, which is the part that future scholars and creators would find most valuable, is already deteriorating. The academic engagement with Gumball has been modest compared to the show's cultural significance. A handful of conference papers, a few references in broader studies of 21st century animation, the occasional undergraduate thesis. The show has not yet received the kind of sustained critical attention that Adventure Time or Steven Universe have attracted, despite the fact that its innovations in mixed media animation and its philosophical depth arguably warrant more analysis than either of those shows. The reason for the disparity is partly timing. The show ended at a moment when academic attention was focused elsewhere, and partly institutional. The show's home on Cartoon Network rather than a streaming platform made it less visible to the generation of scholars who have built their careers analyzing streaming-era animation. The movie that has been announced represents the legacy scandal's potential resolution and its potential amplification. If the movie succeeds, it will rewrite the show's ending, resolve the narrative abandoned by the Inquisition, and demonstrate that the show's audience was large enough and loyal enough to justify the investment. The success of the movie would transform the show's legacy from a story about abandonment into a story about perseverance. But if the movie disappoints, if it fails to capture the quality that made the show worth remembering, if the continuation reveals that the thing that was loved cannot be recaptured, then the legacy scandal will acquire a new and more painful chapter. The show will have been better off ending as it did, unfinished and still wanted, than continuing and proving that the wanting was better than the having. The fans who campaigned for the movie's production bear a specific kind of responsibility within the scandal. They asked for the continuation. They argued for it. They demonstrated through their persistence and their numbers that the audience existed. And the question of whether the audience that exists in sufficient numbers to justify a movie is the same audience that existed during the show's original run is a question that the movie's release will answer definitively. The audience may have changed. The audience may have grown up. The audience may want something different from the show than what the show was built to provide. And the gap between what the audience remembers and what the show actually was, which is the gap that nostalgia both creates and conceals, is the space where the legacy scandal will ultimately be resolved. The 10 scandals, taken together, tell a story that none of them tells individually. They tell the story of a creative work that existed within a system of constraints so complex that no single person could see all of it at once. Legal constraints shape the characters. Privacy constraints shape the backgrounds. Content constraints shape the jokes. Timing constraints shape the schedule. International constraints shape the distribution. Accusation constraints shape the public narrative. Personnel constraints shape the creative direction. Community constraints shape the relationship with the audience. Narrative constraints shaped the ending. And legacy constraints, the ongoing negotiation between memory and reality, shape the show's meaning even now, even as you listen to this. The pattern that emerges from these 10 scandals is not a pattern of victimhood. The show was not a victim of its circumstances. It was a creative work that absorbed its circumstances and transformed them into content that was, at its best, unlike anything else on television. Every constraint that was imposed upon it became material. Every scandal that threatened to diminish it became a chapter in the story of its making. And the story of its making, which is the story these 10 scandals collectively tell, is as interesting and as strange and as worth examining as anything the show itself ever put on screen. The show survived every scandal on this list. It survived the legal disputes and the privacy complaints and the content controversies and the timing sensitivities and the international modifications and the plagiarism accusations and the staff departures and the fan friction and the unfinished ending and the ongoing uncertainty of its legacy. The survival is not incidental. It is the point. The show's capacity to absorb damage and continue producing work of genuine quality is the through line that connects every scandal to every other scandal. Because the show's quality, which is the thing that remains after the scandals have faded, which is the thing that the audience returns to when the controversies have been forgotten, was always more powerful than the forces that tried to diminish it. Which brings us back to the episode that was pulled on September 5th, 2017. The episode that was produced and approved and then removed from the schedule without explanation. The episode exists. It was made. It went through the full production pipeline. And then it was pulled. And the pulling was quiet. And the quiet was the loudest thing about it. Because the quiet said, there are things about this show that you do not know. There are decisions that are made behind closed doors that shape the thing you watch. There are scandals that never become public because the institutions involved have the power to contain them. And perhaps that is what makes these 10 scandals worth the 2 hours you have spent with them. Not the individual controversies, which are each interesting on their own terms, but the cumulative portrait they paint of a show that was always more complicated than it appeared. A show that looked like a children's cartoon and behaved like a meditation on the compromises required to create anything meaningful within the constraints of a commercial entertainment industry. A show that was funny and strange and beautiful, and also, underneath all of that, perpetually embattled by forces that most of its audience never knew existed. The Quiet said, the 10 scandals in this video are the 10 that became visible. The ones you do not know about, the ones that were contained, the ones that were resolved in offices and in meetings and in phone calls that were never documented, those scandals are still out there, still hidden, still shaping the show you love in ways you cannot see. If you found something in these 2 hours that changed how you think about this show, subscribing means more than you might realize. Thank you for staying. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one.